A respected rabbi died, and in those brief moments between life and death, he encountered something that shattered everything he believed. His entire life had been dedicated to the Torah, to the traditions of his ancestors, to the unshakable truth that the Messiah had not yet come. But in that moment, beyond the veil of this world, he saw something he was never prepared to face. What he experienced changed everything. But what exactly did he see? What truth was revealed to him? To understand the depth of this revelation, we must start from the beginning, in the heart of Jerusalem, where ancient prayers rise like incense from the synagogues. Rabbi Ephraim was a man of conviction. From his earliest days, he was immersed in the sacred texts, guided by his grandfather, a devoted scholar who saw in him the future of their faith. By the time he became a rabbi, Ephraim was not just a teacher. He was a defender of the law. He believed without hesitation that truth was found in the Torah alone, and any deviation, any suggestion that the Messiah had already come, was dangerous, even blasphemous. He led his community with passion, his sermons echoing through the synagogues, reinforcing the belief that the real Messiah had yet to arrive. He rejected any claim that pointed to Jesus, dismissing such ideas as misguided, as distortions of the truth. To Ephraim, Jesus was nothing more than a false hope, a deception that had misled many, and he was determined to protect his people from that deception. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that very soon his own certainty would be shaken to the core. Because on a seemingly ordinary night, something was about to happen, something that would take him beyond this world. If you're finding this story intriguing so far, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Your support helps us bring more powerful content like this. Also, drop a comment and let us know, what country are you watching from? We'd love to see how far this message is reaching. The night had settled over Jerusalem. The city bathed in the soft glow of Shabbat candles flickering through windows. Rabbi Ephraim, still reflecting on his passionate sermon, walked through the quiet streets toward a gathering. It was a special evening, a time of prayer and discussion among scholars, where sacred texts would be studied and debated. The room was filled with men dressed in traditional garments, the low hum of Torah verses creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. As the discussion deepened, Ephraim, as always, led with conviction, his voice steady, his words deliberate. But something felt different. A strange sensation crept into his chest, an unfamiliar pressure, subtle at first, but growing rapidly. He tried to ignore it, continuing his discourse on the messianic prophecies, but the discomfort deepened, morphing into a sharp pain that spread through his chest like fire. His breath grew shallow. He reached for the table to steady himself, but the world around him blurred. A sudden wave of dizziness crashed over him. The voices in the room became distant, fragmented. Then the pain intensified, a crushing force gripping his heart. His fingers clutched at his robe. A gasp escaped his lips, and before he could utter another word, his body gave in. He collapsed onto the floor. The room erupted into chaos. Scholars and students rushed to his side, their prayers turning into cries of alarm. Someone shouted for help. Others tried to shake him, to wake him, but his body was unresponsive. The tension was suffocating. A few men ran outside, calling for an ambulance, their voices slicing through the night air. The seconds stretched, each moment heavier than the last. His breathing faltered, his pulse weakening, then silence. His chest stopped moving. His eyes, once filled with wisdom and fire, stared blankly at the ceiling. The panic intensified. Was this the end of the great Rabbi Ephraim? Paramedics arrived within minutes, pushing through the frantic crowd. They wasted no time, assessing his condition as the congregation watched in stunned silence. One of them called out in Hebrew, confirming what everyone feared. His heart had stopped. The bearded men, usually composed, stood frozen, their minds unable to comprehend the gravity of the moment. Time seemed to slow. Prayers mixed with the frantic commands of the medical team. They worked tirelessly, their hands moving with trained precision, pressing against his chest, trying to force life back into his body. But nothing. The ambulance doors swung open, and Ephraim was lifted inside. The sirens pierced the night as they sped through the narrow streets of Jerusalem, racing against the inevitable. Inside, the paramedics continued their desperate attempts, their voices tense, their movements urgent. The monitor showed no rhythm, just a flat, unbroken line. One of them prepared the defibrillator, pressing the paddles against his chest. A shock jolted his body. No response. Another shock. The same result. The lead medic hesitated for a split second before trying once more. And then, suddenly, the unthinkable happened. For a brief moment, everything stopped. Rabbi Ephraim's consciousness was no longer inside the ambulance. He was nowhere near the cries of the paramedics, nor the frantic prayers of his people. He was somewhere else entirely, a place beyond human comprehension, a place of pure light. Ephraim's breath caught in his chest. His mind recoiled. His very soul fought against what his eyes were seeing. No, it couldn't be. It must be a deception, a test, a trick. His entire life had been dedicated to refuting this very possibility, and yet here he was. The man before him radiated an authority that was not imposed but inherent. It was as if the very air bowed to him, as if the light itself emanated from him. Ephraim wanted to look away, to escape this presence that both overwhelmed and called to him. But he couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The weight of it pressed into him, not like chains, but like truth, too great to bear all at once. "I am the fulfillment of all that you have sought," the man said. His voice was not loud, yet it resonated through every part of Ephraim's being. It was authority itself, yet filled with an unfathomable tenderness. Ephraim's heart pounded. No, no, this is not possible. This is not the Messiah. The Messiah has not yet come. His mind reached for every argument, every teaching, every reason he had ever given to others to reject the one standing before him. His lips parted, ready to speak, to refute, to declare the law of Moses, to remind himself of the truth he had always known. But no words came. The man took a step closer, and suddenly visions unfolded before Ephraim's eyes. Not just memories, not just images, but revelation. He saw the prophecies he had studied his entire life, the promises of the Tanakh, now interwoven with moments he had never dared to consider. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son, Isaiah 7:14. And he saw a young woman, Miriam, holding a child, radiant with the light of heaven. They pierced my hands and my feet, Psalm 22:16. And he saw a man suspended on a cross, blood pouring from wounds that matched the very words he had read but never understood. He was wounded for our transgressions, Isaiah 53:5. And he saw this man, the one standing before him, taking upon himself the punishment that was meant for others. Ephraim squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. No, these passages had other meanings. The rabbis always taught, "You studied the scriptures, but you did not see." The voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. Ephraim's chest tightened. His defenses, once so strong, now felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The visions did not stop. He saw Jesus walking among the people of Israel, healing the sick, opening blind eyes, speaking words that burned with divine truth. He saw the rejection, the betrayal, the crucifixion, but then he saw the empty tomb. He saw the risen king, and then he saw himself, standing in a synagogue, passionately declaring that this could not be true. He saw his own words, his own denials, and yet here he was, standing before the very one he had spent his life rejecting. Ephraim's knees gave out. He fell to the ground, trembling. He could feel the weight of truth crashing over him. Relentless, undeniable, but still something inside him resisted. "No," he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "This is not how it was supposed to be." The man, Jesus, looked at him, his expression filled not with anger, not with condemnation, but with something far more unbearable. Love. Ephraim could barely breathe. He remained on his knees, shaken to his very core. The weight of this encounter was crushing, yet not in a way that destroyed. It revealed everything he had ever known. Everything he had ever taught was now being questioned in the light of this one undeniable reality. Jesus stood before him, the very name he had refused to utter, the very idea he had spent his entire life refuting. His mind fought against it, searching for a way out, an explanation, something, anything that could make sense of this moment in accordance with what he had always believed. But the visions continued. He saw the prophets, Moses, Isaiah, David, Daniel, each pointing toward the one before him. He saw their words fulfilled in ways he had never considered. Every verse, every prophecy, every law had led to this, yet he could not accept it. He was Rabbi Ephraim, a teacher of the Torah, a defender of the faith. His people trusted him. His ancestors had upheld this truth for centuries. To accept what he was seeing now was to betray everything, to betray everyone. A deep, aching sorrow filled his chest. He lifted his gaze, trembling, and met the eyes of Jesus. You have always longed for truth, Ephraim, and now it stands before you. His heart clenched. His breathing was uneven. How could this be? How could this be? And then, suddenly, darkness. The light was gone. The voices, the visions, the overwhelming presence, all of it disappeared in an instant. He was falling, being pulled away, as if something had gripped him and yanked him back into the world he had left behind. His eyes shot open. Harsh fluorescent lights burned above him. His body ached. His chest was sore, as if fire had been pressed against his ribs. A distant beeping filled the room. Monitors, machines, voices. He was alive. A gasp escaped his lips as he struggled to make sense of his surroundings. The sterile white walls of a hospital room replaced the ethereal glow he had been engulfed in moments before. His breathing was erratic, his heart still pounding. Had it been a dream, a vision, a hallucination? Ephraim, a familiar voice cracked with emotion. He turned his head. His wife Rivka stood beside the bed, her eyes brimming with tears. Her hands trembled as they reached for his. "You're back," she whispered. You weren't breathing, the doctors. They said you were gone, but then..." Her voice broke, her grip tightening. The doctors murmured in the background, some exchanging glances, others checking his vitals. They had fought to bring him back, and yet it was not them who had returned him. Ephraim's lips parted, but no words came. His mind was a storm, flashing with images, with voices, with questions that had no answers. He wanted to tell her, to tell them all, what he had seen, what he had heard. But how could he? He had denied this. He had taught others to reject it. He felt Rivka's touch on his arm, grounding him in reality. "You need to rest," she said softly, but concern shadowed her voice. "You've been through something terrible." He turned away, staring at the ceiling, his heart racing. Had he? Or had he just seen something far more terrifying? In the days that followed, Ephraim remained silent about what had happened. He gave the doctors the answers they wanted. Yes, he felt weak. Yes, he was grateful to be alive. Yes, he would rest. But inside, his soul was in turmoil. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw him, Jesus, speaking to him, showing him the scriptures, revealing truths he had never dared to consider. And the worst part, it wasn't fading. Hallucinations disappear, dreams blur and dissolve upon waking. But this was still there, as sharp, as clear, as undeniable as the moment it had happened. Yet how could it be real? Had he been deceived? Was it a test from God? Was it a punishment for something he had done? His fingers tightened around the hospital blanket as he wrestled with the implications. If what he saw was true, if Jesus truly was the Messiah, then everything about his life was wrong. He tried to push it aside. He told himself it was just a near-death experience, the brain creating illusions. But when he prayed, when he recited the Shema, there was a silence where once there had been certainty. For the first time in his life, Ephraim felt like a stranger to his own faith. And no matter how hard he tried to fight it, he knew one thing for certain: this doubt would not leave him. Ephraim had always been a man of certainty. His entire life was built on a foundation of absolute truths, truths he had studied, defended, and taught to countless others. But now, for the first time, he was unsure. He sat by the window of his home, staring at the ancient streets of Jerusalem, his hands resting on the Torah that lay open before him. The words that once felt like fire in his bones now felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. He tried to pray, but the words felt hollow. He tried to study, but the pages no longer carried the same weight. Something had changed. It wasn't just an experience. It wasn't just a vision. It was real as the air in his lungs. He had seen Jesus. The very name made his chest tighten. He had never spoken it before, never even allowed the thought to take root in his mind. And now it echoed inside him like an unrelenting force. His teachings, his sermons, his convictions, all of them were now under siege. He tried to dismiss it, tried to rationalize it away. Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe it was a test. Maybe it was an attack from the enemy. But the more he fought it, the stronger it became. The memories of that place, the light, the voices, the presence, were more real than anything he had ever known. And then there was his gaze. Jesus had looked at him, not with anger, not with condemnation, but with a love so deep, so pure, that it unsettled him more than anything else. That love was not the love of a mere man. It was the love of God, and that terrified him. Ephraim had always loved the scriptures. They were his passion, his calling, his very identity, but now they were turning against him. Every passage, every prophecy he read seemed to whisper his name. They have pierced my hands and my feet, Psalm 22:16. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, Isaiah 53:7. They will look upon me, the one they have pierced, Zechariah 12:10. The words were there. They had always been there. So why had he never seen them? For years he had been taught to avoid these passages, or to reinterpret them, to explain them away. But now, after what he had seen, they burned with a new meaning. Could it be? Could it truly be? Could Jesus be the Messiah? Ephraim slammed the book shut, his hands shaking. No. He could not allow himself to think this way. If he continued down this path, he would lose everything: his wife, his family, his community, his entire life. And yet, he had already lost something: his certainty, his peace. For years, Ephraim had prayed with confidence, knowing that God heard him. But now, whenever he prayed, it was as if he were speaking into a vast silence. Where was the God of his fathers? Why was he not answering? He had spent his whole life defending the truth. He had lived in obedience. He had done everything right. So why was his faith slipping through his fingers? And why, no matter how much he fought, did he feel like Jesus was the answer he had been searching for? The more he tried to push it away, the stronger it pulled him in. It was as if God had spoken and now waited for him to respond. Late into the night, long after his wife had gone to sleep, Ephraim sat in the dim glow of the candlelight, wrestling with himself. He knew what he needed to do, but he was afraid. His heart pounded as he reached for a book that had never entered his home before, a book he had once sworn to never read, the New Testament. His fingers hesitated over the cover. His pulse quickened. If he opened it, if he even took one step further down this road, there would be no turning back. And yet, deep inside, he knew. He had to know the truth. He took a deep breath, and then, with trembling hands, he opened the book. The candle flickered, casting shifting shadows across the walls as Ephraim sat motionless, staring at the open book in his hands. The pages felt foreign, forbidden, yet strangely familiar. His fingers trembled as they traced the words that had been hidden from him his entire life. He hesitated, battling the weight of years of warnings, teachings, and prohibitions. To read this book was to step onto dangerous ground. It was an act of betrayal. A door that once opened could never be shut again. But something deep inside urged him forward. He had to know. The first words of the Gospel of Matthew struck him like a whisper from eternity. The book of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. His breath caught. Messiah, son of David. These were not foreign terms. They were the very foundation of Jewish expectation. His entire life he had awaited the promised descendant of David, the one who would bring redemption to Israel. He read on, his mind racing. Every name in the lineage confirmed what he already knew. This book was not written by outsiders. It was not the work of Gentiles twisting their way into Israel's covenant. This was written by Jews, by men of his own blood, men who had walked the streets of Jerusalem, who had lived under Roman rule, who had prayed in the same synagogues and longed for the same redemption. The words unfolded like a story he had always known, but never understood. The prophecies he had read for years, about a virgin conceiving, about a king coming humbly on a donkey, about a suffering servant bearing the sins of the people, were here, not as distant shadows, but as events fulfilled. He turned to the Gospel of John, his heart pounding. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He swallowed hard, his mind spinning. How could this be? Was this blasphemy, or was this the mystery of the Almighty revealed? Hours passed, but he did not stop. He devoured the words, flipping from passage to passage, drawn deeper into something that both terrified and fascinated him. He read of miracles, of blind men seeing, of lepers healed with a touch. He read of teachings that burned with authority, words that carried a power unlike anything he had encountered before. And then he reached the crucifixion. The scene shook him to his core. The suffering, the rejection, the weight of the sacrifice. He had spent his entire life believing that no righteous man would suffer such a death. And yet, the very scriptures he revered had spoken of a servant who would be pierced for the transgressions of the people. A cold realization gripped him. Had he been blind all along? He closed the book, pressing his hands against his forehead. He could feel the war within. Himself, his heart pulling in one direction, his identity, his loyalty, his entire world pulling in another. If this was true, if Jesus was the Messiah, then everything had changed. But if he accepted it, he would lose everything. He would be an outcast, a traitor, a man with no home, his wife, his family, his community. What would they say? What would they do? He could not afford to be reckless. He needed more proof, more understanding. So he did what no rabbi in his position should do. He began searching in secret. Late at night, when the house was silent, he studied the forbidden texts, comparing them with the Torah, the Talmud, the writings of the sages. He combed through the messianic prophecies again and again, this time without the interpretations he had always been given, and with each verse, the walls he had built in his mind began to crack. Days turned into weeks, and the struggle only deepened. He could no longer teach with the same certainty. The words he once spoke with confidence now felt empty. When he looked into the eyes of his students, he wondered if he was leading them toward truth or away from it. His prayers became desperate, his soul crying out for clarity. But no matter how much he asked, the answer was always the same. He already knew the truth. The question was whether he would accept it. But acceptance came with a cost. And Ephraim knew deep down that the moment he spoke of this truth, his life as he knew it would be over. Ephraim had never felt so alone. The weight of what he had discovered pressed against his chest like an unbearable burden. He had spent weeks, months, searching, questioning, hoping for a flaw in what he had found. But there was none. Every prophecy, every scripture, every historical account pointed to the same undeniable truth. Jesus was the Messiah. The very one he had spent his life denying was the one his people had been waiting for all along. But knowing the truth and accepting it were two different things. He sat in the dimly lit study of his home, his hands gripping the edges of the table, his mind running in circles. How could he admit this? To say it out loud would be the end of everything. His wife, his children, his students, his colleagues, they would never look at him the same again. He had seen it happen before. He had participated in it before. Men who strayed, who even hinted at such ideas, were cast out, stripped of their status, their homes, their very identities. They were dead to the community. And now he was on the verge of becoming one of them. Rivka had noticed the change in him. She was not a woman easily deceived. For weeks, she had watched him grow distant, his sleepless nights stretching longer, his words measured with unusual caution. He no longer spoke with the fire he once had, no longer led prayers with the same confidence. He avoided certain discussions. He flinched at certain words. Tonight, she could no longer hold back. "What is happening to you?" she asked softly, standing in the doorway of the study. Her voice was laced with concern, but beneath it there was something sharper, fear. Ephraim did not answer immediately. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind, but now that it had arrived, he found himself unable to speak. He looked at her, the woman who had stood by his side for years, the mother of his children, the keeper of his home. He saw the concern in her eyes, the quiet pleading for him to give an answer that would not confirm her worst suspicions. But he could not lie to her, not anymore. "I've been reading," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. She took a step closer. "Reading what?" He hesitated, then exhaled, his fingers tightening into fists. "The New Testament." The silence that followed was suffocating. Rivka's face paled. For a long moment, she simply stared at him as if she had misheard. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "No, you wouldn't." "I had to." Her lips parted, but no words came. She took another step forward, searching his face, as if she could find some reassurance that this was a misunderstanding, but there was none. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her hands clenched at her sides. "Ephraim, tell me you don't believe it," she whispered. "Tell me this was just curiosity." He looked at her, and for the first time, he saw it clearly. There was no way back. Tears filled her eyes as she took a step away from him. "What have you done?" she choked out. "I have found the truth," he said softly. "No." She shook her head violently. "You have been deceived. She stopped, her hands pressing against her face as she struggled to compose herself. When she looked at him again, something had changed. "Do you have any idea what this means?" "I do." "Then stop now," she pleaded, "before it's too late." Ephraim closed his eyes for a moment, then reopened them. "It's already too late." She let out a small, broken sob before turning away, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of a chair for support. "If the others find out, they will," he admitted. "Eventually." She swallowed hard, then whispered, "Then you will lose everything." He knew. He had counted the cost. And yet, even as fear gripped him, a strange peace settled in his heart. He had spent his entire life searching for truth, and now that he had found it, how could he deny it? The next day, the whispers began. His colleagues noticed his hesitation in the synagogue. His students sensed the shift in his words. People talked. A simple conversation became a rumor became a question, and soon questions turned into confrontation. A week later, he was called before the Council of Rabbis, and he knew, as he stepped into that room, that his life as he had known it was over. The air inside the council chamber was thick with silence, heavier than any words that could be spoken. 12 men sat before him, their faces lined with wisdom, authority, and something else, expectation. The room was small, but suffocating. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with centuries of Jewish teachings, interpretations, and laws. These were men who had guided him, counseled him, respected him, and now they looked at him as if he were a stranger. Ephraim had been called before the council many times before, but never like this, never with his own faith on trial. Rabbi Yaakov, the eldest of the group, cleared his throat, his piercing eyes never leaving Ephraim's face. "You know why you're here?" It was not a question. Ephraim nodded. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm. "Yes." "You have been troubled," Yaakov continued, choosing his words carefully. "Your teachings have changed. Your words lack conviction. And there are rumors." His gaze sharpened. "Are they true?" The words hung in the air, pressing against him, waiting to crush him. This was the moment. He could lie. He could retreat. He could tell them what they wanted to. Here, walk out of this room and pretend none of this had happened. But he couldn't. He had seen the truth. He had seen him. Ephraim took a slow, steady breath, and with a voice that no longer trembled, he answered, Yes, they are true. The room erupted. Voices overlapped in disbelief, some in anger, others in horror. A few slammed their hands against the table, shaking their heads, while others simply stared, as if struggling to believe that a man like Ephraim, one of their best, one of their most devoted, could fall so far. Rabbi Moshe, one of the younger members, leaned forward, his voice strained. "Tell us this is a misunderstanding." Ephraim met his eyes. "It is not." A murmur spread through the room like wildfire. Yaakov's fingers drummed against the wooden table. "Do you understand what you are saying? What you are doing?" "I do," Ephraim said, his voice steady. "I have spent my life waiting for the Messiah, and I have found him." Moshe recoiled, as if struck. "You are speaking blasphemy." "No," Ephraim replied softly. "I am speaking truth." The room fell deathly silent. Yaakov exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. Then, with slow, measured words, he asked, "You claim Jesus is the Messiah?" The weight of the moment pressed down on him, the point of no return. Ephraim inhaled deeply, then spoke the words that would cost him everything. "Yes, I do." The silence shattered. Yaakov stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Then you are no longer one of us." His voice was final, like a gavel striking the end of a trial. Ephraim's breath caught, but he did not look away. "You are to leave this place," Yaakov continued, his voice laced with sorrow. "You are no longer welcome in this community. You have chosen another path." A coldness settled in Ephraim's bones. He had always known this was coming, but now that it was happening, the reality of it was suffocating. Moshe stood as well, his eyes burning with fury. "You have betrayed your people." "No," Ephraim whispered. "I have found what we were all searching for." Yaakov's face darkened. "You will leave before sundown. If you return, you will not be met with kindness." Ephraim bowed his head, not out of defeat, but out of sorrow. These were his brothers, his teachers, his family, and now he was nothing to them. As he turned to leave, no one stopped him. No one pleaded for him to reconsider. By the time he stepped outside, the streets of Jerusalem felt different, quieter, emptier. He had spent his entire life belonging. Now he had nowhere to go. The news spread faster than he had anticipated. By the time he reached his home, Rivka was already waiting for him at the door. Her face was pale, her hands clenched into fists. She didn't ask. She already knew. Her voice was hollow. "They've excommunicated you." "Yes." Her throat tightened, and for a moment she looked as if she might collapse. Then, barely above a whisper, she asked the question he had been dreading. "And what about us?" Ephraim's chest ached. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. He swallowed hard. "I love you, Rivka. I love our children, but I cannot unsee what I have seen. I cannot deny the truth." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I cannot follow you down this path." His heart shattered. "Then what will you do?" "I will stay," she whispered. "And you must go." The final blow. She turned away before he could see the tears spill down her cheeks. By nightfall, he was gone. He walked through the streets that had once been his home, through the alleys where his children had played, past the synagogues where he had prayed. But he was no longer welcome. The weight of exile pressed upon him. He had lost everything. His home, his family, his name. And yet beneath the sorrow, beneath the unbearable loneliness, there was something else. Peace. Because though he had lost everything, he had found the Messiah. Ephraim walked through the streets of Jerusalem with no destination, no home, and no name. He had been stripped of everything, his family, his position, his place among his people. The faces that once greeted him with respect now turned away. Some glared in silent judgment, others whispered behind his back. He had become an outsider overnight, a man without a community. And yet, he did not regret his decision. For the first time in his life, he was free, not in the way he had once imagined, but in a way that ran deeper than comfort or belonging. He had spent his entire life searching for the truth, defending it, teaching it, and now he had found it in the most unexpected place, in Jesus. But what now? Where would he go? Who would take him in? He wandered for days, sleeping in hidden corners of the city, avoiding places where he might be recognized. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, exhaustion weighed down his body, but something stronger than his physical weakness kept him moving. He could not explain it, but he knew he was not alone. On the fourth day he met them, a small group of men and women gathered in a dimly lit home on the outskirts of the city. Their voices were hushed, their movements careful. At first, he thought they were just another group of Jews studying Torah in secret, but as he listened, his heart pounded in recognition. They spoke of the Messiah. They spoke of Jesus, Messianic Jews. His breath caught in his chest. He had heard whispers of them before, Jews who had accepted Jesus, who had been cast out just as he had. He had once mocked them, dismissed them as deceived. Now he stood among them, uncertain, hesitant, but desperate for something, anything that resembled home. A man named Levi noticed him lingering in the doorway. He had a strong, weathered face, marked by suffering, but his eyes held something Ephraim had not seen in days, understanding. "You've been cast out," Levi said, not as a question, but as a statement. Ephraim nodded. Levi gestured for him to sit. "Then you are one of us." The words hit him harder than he expected. One of us. For the first time since he had been excommunicated, he was not alone. That night he listened. He spoke little, still unsure of how to put his thoughts into words. But as he heard their stories of rejection, of loss, of the cost of following Jesus, he realized that his pain was not unique. They had all walked this path before him, and yet despite the suffering, despite the exile, there was a joy in their voices, a peace in their eyes. They had lost everything, and yet they had gained something far greater. Ephraim stayed with them. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. He studied, not as a rabbi looking to defend his traditions, but as a man desperate to understand the fullness of what he had encountered. The Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, they all pointed to him. It was there all along, hidden in plain sight, and now he could see it clearly. As time passed, something changed within him. The sorrow of what he had lost was still there, but it no longer defined him. In its place, a new purpose began to grow. One evening, as they sat in the candle-lit room, Levi turned to him and asked, "What will you do now, Ephraim?" He had been asking himself that same question for months. He had no home, no family, no community. But he had faith, he had truth, and he had a mission. "There are others," Ephraim said, his voice steady. "Others like me, others who are searching, others who do not yet see." He looked around at them, at the men and women who had become his new family. "I cannot stay silent. I have to tell them." Levi nodded, his eyes filled with something between pride and sorrow. "Then you are ready." And so Ephraim stepped into a new life, no longer as Rabbi Ephraim, the teacher of the law, but as Ephraim, the disciple of the Messiah. He traveled from city to city, speaking in whispers, meeting in hidden places, finding those who, like him, had begun to question but were too afraid to seek. He spoke with conviction, not as a man who had read about Jesus, but as one who had met him. Some listened, some rejected him outright. Some, like his old self, fought against the truth with all their strength, but a few believed. And for them, he would give everything. He had lost his past, but his future had just begun. Rabbi Ephraim lost everything, his position, his community, even his own family, but in the end, he found something far greater. He set out on a journey that cost him everything he had ever known, yet led him to the one truth he had always sought. The question is, what about you? Could it be that you, too, have been resisting a truth that has been right in front of you all along? What if the answers you've been searching for are already waiting, just beyond the limits of what you've always believed? Tell me in the comments, what part of this story impacted you the most? Let's continue this conversation together. And before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There's much more to uncover, and I promise you won't want to miss it.